Hugo Chan practices a research-driven architecture and is the director and principal architect at Studio HC. And his works mostly revolve around adaptive reuse and its effects within the urban context. So, this involves a lot of social, cultural, and sustainability efforts, and a whole list that we will talk about today. Hugo is also the architect and associate practice management of Cracknell and Lonergan Architects since 2011, focusing primarily on conservation, planning, environmental law, and urban residential development. Then he also contributes as an educator at the University of New South Wales Built Environment since 2016 and also at University of Sydney's Master Architecture program as of this year. So today we are going to hear about the many different hats he has in research, adaptation, and architecture. So thank you so much, Hugo, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool. First off, can you tell us a bit about yourself, so your studio and then your work as well?
So I founded, I suppose, Studio HC, my own studio, back in 2018. Although prior to that, I'd already been kind of working private jobs.
Yes.
And this basically ran in parallel to my research work, which I was doing individually and through the support of different organizations, so government agencies as well as the universities. Um, and also running in parallel to that was actually my full-time job, which was, at once both kind of just giving me the stability to do my own thing in my own time, as
Mm.
well as, kind of how I could apply the research that I did privately into an actual building context and a much larger kind of corporate culture.
Right. So they're complementing each other.
Yes, I think in everything that I do, I guess, whether it's with teaching, with research, with writing, and contributing to discourse in Sydney, as well as practice or this traditional idea of what an architect's supposed to
Mm.
do. I always kind of try to have this cross pollination and try to see where are there opportunities for me as a designer and as an architect to kind of go beyond, perhaps these general ideas of what we think an architect does just as a builder or an artist or a drawer.
That's great. And I think you mentioned a lot about research and put a lot of emphasis on the research aspect of design. So, why or how has it been rewarding for you?
I think the research comes very much out of my time as a university student, is that I felt that when I was studying architecture and doing my master's, and we have, a thesis course that we
Mm.
all have to do, there was a very strong emphasis on this idea of research, on how we should study not just a site in terms of its physical constraints and its kind of, legislative constraints, or, height limit, floor space control, but actually going in depth and looking at the social, cultural, and ecological components, and
Mm.
possibly also, in many cases, the economical components of how a city functions and operates, and how a particular society functions and operates. And I think that was what kind of got me thinking about, but, when we go into practice day to day, we kind of do things very often unquestioningly. We
Mm.
just take things for granted, or increasingly, one of the problems in a lot of architectural practice is that we've become very, very specialized. You know, things that we don't know, we can get a consultant for, and
Mm.
whether that's a structural engineer, an electrical engineer, a sustainability consultant.
Right.
In Australia, we also work with heritage architects, as a completely separate thing to what the design architect, so called, would be doing. So, increasingly, I also felt that architects were backing themselves into a smaller and smaller niche of what we kind of think of as design and what we would define as design, without trying to understand all of these other people that are actually equally engaged in this whole
Mm.
thing that we call design process in order to construct a building. And I'm not saying that we all have to become registered engineers and practicing sustainability consultants, but it's actually about having enough of an understanding that we can engage with them so that we don't just completely give that whole aspect of a project to them and tell them, oh, you solve this problem for me because, it's not my job anymore. I've always felt that an architect is actually this, simultaneously a generalist and a specialist. You
Mm.
have to have an understanding of what everyone is doing, and buildings are becoming more and more complex. We can go back to ancient Rome when everything was just stone, really. Whereas now buildings have all of these living, breathing systems that have to be integrated into it, whether it's IT services, whether it's something as simple as air conditioning, and then, even facades, how facades respond to sunlight. And all of that has to come out of research in some way. And
Mm.
I think that the first step for an architect is to understand those basic principles, of, say, what is sustainability? What is heritage? What
Right.
does that mean within the particular context that you're working in? And that through research, by kind of at least gaining a general or basic understanding from that, um, I actually think that a better design outcome can be achieved, and a more enriched project that is actually more responsive, to its conditions can also be achieved.
Right. Right. So our knowledge can be compartmentalized because we each have different specialty and expertise. So maybe one is in architecture and design, one is in structure. But kind of what you're saying is that research is the one principle that ties everything together. So you kind of have to know the research part of it.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And I also think, I can only speak for Sydney, which is where I've spent most of my life practicing. And increasingly, what I've noticed, especially since I became an educator, is there's this constant disjunct between academia and practice,
Mm.
um, which I kind of find problematic. Like, we kind of think of, people who are teaching at universities only do that, and they've never practiced architecture,
Mm.
and that people who practice architecture can't teach. And one of these kind of ongoing complaints which always happens is that, why is it that students come out of university and don't seem to know anything about how a real architecture firm works? And that for me was an interesting thing. It probably is a valid criticism to a certain extent, but it also raises a very interesting question. So why is that? Why is either academia and universities not more engaged with the day-to-day workings of practicing architects, and vice
Mhm.
versa? Why are even small architectural practices, big architectural practices have their research wings, but small architectural practices, which is the majority of architectural practices, aren't necessarily being explained or articulated, or they don't necessarily have the same kind of voice,
Right.
um, as compared. I mean, the major firms, in Sydney, places like, Blythe Volunmeed, BVN, or even engineering firms at Arup, produce incredible research, both on their own as well as through partnerships with the university. Um, but I suppose one of the interesting things is whether that same research can be used for the architectural community at large, which is mainly composed of small individual firms, which might be 5 to 10 people, or
Mm.
even sole practitioners like myself, um, rather than just kind of in this stratification of major companies.
Mm. Can you tell us about one of your works to sort of illustrate this example, maybe?
Sure. I think if I talk about adaptation as one of these examples, I can juggle two scales. I think the company that I work for, Cracknell and Lonergan Architects, we're currently overseeing a project in North Sydney here, which is the conversion of a commercial office block into a series of residential apartments. So it's a fairly modest project. It's only 4 stories. And 5 apartments, and we're retaining office space on the ground floor. And based on that, we went through this whole exercise. We went to the site, as you do, you study it as you're taught, but beyond that was also trying to understand the existing structural integrity of the building. It's this kind of very simple concrete frame building, and a lot of the time when we're confronted with an adaptation project, and in my own research, which I undertook in 2018, I noticed this in some buildings, is that we kind of use adaptation sometimes only as an excuse, where we try to squeeze in the new function into the existing building, whether that's because you have to retain an existing building or whether there's some benefit in doing that. And I find that a problem, because I don't think that's actually thinking about adaptation seriously. That's just you saying, oh, we've got space here, let's just shove the new use inside it, which is, not great. And you can see that, I have seen examples of adaptations from, say, warehouse spaces into residential, where columns are in the middle of the living room, or very awkward in the planning. And you look at the plan and you can just tell that, well, it's because we've tried to force the floor plan of a residential typology into a previous commercial typology. So in this project in North Sydney, what we tried really hard to do was to exceed the minimum standards for residential design, because the column structure of this commercial building gave us a kind of grid that we felt was beneficial to work with. And what that meant was, is that we had extra large living spaces, extra large bedroom spaces, but fewer apartments overall. And that was not a tough sell, but that required some convincing to the client, because the client can look at that and say, well, I've got X amount of floor space and I want as many apartments as possible.
Right.
And it was actually through the research and through also the design stages where we were explaining that, but actually a better design outcome is achieved by working with the building that you have, with the structure that you have and the grid that you have, and meeting all of the kind of regulatory requirements and exceeding them as a way of justifying a design. And in the end, we got away with it. So this project, in spite of the fact that it's 4 stories with ground floor commercial, as I said, it only has 5 apartments in the end, mainly because they have very generous spacings to work with the existing structural grid. So that's kind of one example. A second one, which I've worked on in my private capacity in Studio HC, similarly does that, which is for a house conversion in the south coast of New South Wales. It's in a place called Jervis Bay, which I'm currently discussing with the client. And it's quite fascinating. This house is 2 stories, but the entire ground floor is a garage. So it's a giant kind of space that's a garage, which is really quite a waste. And the client wants to convert that into part home office, part extra bedrooms, extra living rooms. So it's a very modest conversion. But what we noticed immediately is that the floor to ceiling heights of this little house did not comply with current standards, because it had these massive structural beams running diagonally across. So what we had to do was actually, what I ended up doing after studying it and how the structure works and how fire isolation and all this kind of stuff would happen, is to come up with a system of vaulting so that you could actually gain additional height wherever possible. And I don't think that would have been achieved without actually going through this kind of very detailed process of thinking about what can be removed, but also what can be kept, and then minimizing, through this exercise in adaptation, minimizing everything that had to be demolished so that you actually think really hard about what's existing and then kind of going from there. So I suppose that gives you two examples, in a very long-winded way, of how you can kind of work with existing buildings critically, and
Right.
kind of trying to go beyond just, seeing it for what it is and kind of digging under the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, the way I see it is a lot of these adaptive reuse projects are a matter of priority. Yeah. You're faced with an existing building or structure, then you also have your own design and your own agenda. So it becomes all about prioritizing which one is more important. Say, if preserving the existing structure is more important than anything else, then you will not force your design into it, right? Not to forget, all this will translate to the outcome of it. So, if you were to pinpoint the most important aspects of adaptation, what would those be?
I think in adaptation, what is the most important? There can be so many. I'd say the social and the cultural generally take precedence. And I would actually put that under this umbrella term of sustainability as
Hmm.
well. So I think so often when we talk about sustainability, we tend to think of it as being about ecological. And I think in this kind of age of climate crisis, that is the aspect or the attribute that has forefront, which it in many ways so it should. But I think sustainability, if we go back to the original definition of ecologically sustainable development from the Brundtland report in the 1970s, we actually find that sustainability is a tripartite thing, and it operates in an environmental, a sociocultural, and an economic context. And I think adaptive reuse, if we think about it in terms of sustainability and sociocultural responsibility in that sense, falls cleanly within all three things. Obviously, there are environmental benefits in adapting buildings. You don't have to demolish fabric, which means that you keep a lot of the embodied energy, which is excellent. So you actually reduce the amount of material that is used. There is a sociocultural aspect, which is, for me, the strongest one, as I've said, which is linked to this idea that our cities and our buildings embody memories, and memories of not just significant cultural events in the course of a country or a city's development, but it can be as simple as, when I was growing up as a kid, I really have fond memories of that particular place. And I think when architects actually try to uncover the significance of a community, we can actually discover a lot of these beautiful stories and these kind of little hidden jewels in our communities and in our neighborhoods. And so in that sense, whether or not a building has to be adapted because the law says it must, which is normally what happens in heritage contexts, I actually think that architects should try to think about it as a starting point, because of this benefit, is that there is a story in all of the buildings. Not always a nice story, not always an important, historically monumental story, but nevertheless a story about the city. And so it allows architects to then kind of either play with it. What can I add to the story to give buildings new life or its second life? Or change it. What is the story of the city today? And how do we juxtapose that with the city that has come before me? and how will the city change again for the future? So in that sense, I think that's what adaptive reuse allows for, is it gives us this flexibility, and it allows us to not just think about architecture constantly as this obsession with iconic buildings, with newness, with because it's new, it must be better, and because it's new, it must be good. Whereas if we actually stop and think about what is already here, I
Mm.
think we can actually find a lot of good things. And sometimes these things don't necessarily have to be changed. All they have to do is just be polished and tidied up. And then they will be made new again and made just as relevant for the 21st century and beyond.
Right. And preserving these memories has a whole range of extent, right? So maybe, like in your previous example, there are some architects that just conserve the structure as an accessory. So there will be like a column in the middle of the living room, where there are also those that try to incorporate them into the design, is to show that it can go from like simply having a painting on the wall about what the space used to be to actually trying to use it in the making of the next thing. I know there is no proper formula to doing adaptation, but maybe in your observations and experience, what have been the more successful ones?
I think many of them find this perfect balance between what should be demolished. And I'm not saying, so I also don't want to frame adaptation as though we must keep everything.
Hmm.
Very often you can't, for all sorts of reasons, whether, because there are different types of obsolescence that all buildings have to accept. And I think architects sometimes don't necessarily think long term enough, which has also come through in my research. Very often we kind of only think about the building up to the point it's completed. The clients have moved in, they're really happy. That's the end of it. Whereas I kind of also ask the question, what might my project look like in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, in 50 years' time? Will it still be there? If it's not there, why will it need to be demolished or changed? And that's a very difficult question, because ultimately it's almost like you're trying to predict a future that you don't know yet, of
Mm-hmm.
course. But I think the successful adaptation projects that I've seen when I was doing my research in London, for example, there's a wonderful building by a company called Shepherd Robson, and it's called the Sammy Ofer Centre at the London Business School. And they struck this perfect balance in converting this old council building, Westminster Town Hall, into the new kind of learning hub for the London Business School. And they were able to remove things that they knew weren't operating well. There are new requirements, obviously large spaces like lecture halls and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But then they were also able to convert the library and do very minimal interventions, as well as just other fine detail things like keeping the same proportion of windows. And I also mean keeping, where the steel used to be in the original windows, but actually upgrading the glass so that overall the performance of the building would improve. So that requires a very kind of in-depth understanding of,
And research.
yes, and research of the original proportions, of windows even, rather than just saying, oh, well, these windows are old and they don't perform to current environmental standards, so let's just remove all of them and then put in new windows that we can get off the shelf. It's obviously been a lot more critical and thoughtful than that. So that's, I think, a really great example of how through studying and actually knowing the history of a building, you can actually kind of engage with it and then create unique contemporary additions to kind of complement it. So yeah.
Cool. Is there any last words or anything else you'd like to add with regards to research and or adaptation?
I think the question architects should confront themselves with whenever they start a project is, do I actually have to do anything new? Or
Mm.
rather, what is the reason for demolition? I think that's very important to ask. So often when we think about adaptive reuse, it's just in a heritage context, and it's because the law says you can't demolish a building. And
Mhm.
I think, given all its benefits, in terms of a social, economic, environmental reason, as I've talked about, adaptive reuse needs to be thought of far more broadly in architecture generally, and that it kind of almost needs to be the starting point of every project in urban contexts. Do I need to demolish, or can we actually do little changes or gradated changes rather than just start completely afresh?
Nice. I think that's so important. And yeah, I think we pretty much got the important points of adaptation because I am sure there will only be more and more projects in this regard as there are not that many green space left right in this world. So we will only be adapting more and more buildings to new functions. That said, it is important to understand the research aspect of doing this and keeping the more important parts in the social, ecological, and economical sense. So, yeah, thank you so much, Hugo, for your insights. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great to speak to you today.